In this video, we'll be removing an intake manifold on a Volkswagen. First, start by removing the engine cover. Then we'll remove the air intake, air cleaner box, and the mass airflow sensor. Use a small screwdriver to release the electrical connector. Remove the hose clamp. And the air cleaner box will pull free of the rubber grommets. Next, we'll remove the breather hose. Be careful with the release clips on this hose as they're easy to break. We'll disconnect the fuel supply hose from its rubber mounts. And disconnect the evaporative emissions purge hose from the purge valve. And then push that out of the way. Disconnect the electrical connectors from the throttle body. And then we'll disconnect the boost pressure sensor. Now we can remove the air intake hose. There is a Torx bolt as well as hose clamps on either end of the hose. There's a wire bracket mount that needs to be removed, also a Torx bolt. We'll remove the coolant hose mounts from the side of the manifold. And now we will raise the vehicle up and remove the plastic undershields. Now we can access the intake tube from underneath and finish removing the Torx bolts holding that in place. Now we'll lower the vehicle back down. We will remove the throttle body, which is 4 Torx bolts from underneath. Can be a little bit difficult to get to. Use some angled pliers to reach those hoses. Once those are free, can be pushed up out of the way, and the throttle body can be removed. Next, we'll disconnect the high pressure fuel line. Make sure you have the right size wrench as to not round out that fuel line fitting. Disconnect the vacuum hose. Again, being careful with those plastic clips. We'll reach underneath and disconnect that temperature sensor. Be helpful to use a small screwdriver to release that lock tab. And then we'll remove the vacuum hose for the intake runner. Remove the high pressure fuel sensor connector. And then we will remove the mounting bolts for the intake manifold next. There are Torx headed bolts as well as 10 millimeters. An electric ratchet will make this easier. Now the manifold's loose. Next, we need to remove the oil filter. This may be a good time to change your oil. With the oil filter out of the way, we can disconnect the intake runner position sensor. And then we'll also need to disconnect the camshaft position sensor. With all of the wires and hoses disconnected, we can pull the intake manifold away from the engine. On this direct injected engine, sometimes the injectors will stay in the cylinder head. Next, we'll remove the wire harness. And with those free, the manifold can be removed. To carefully pull any fuel injectors that's remained in the cylinder head. Okay, now we can begin to transfer parts from the old manifold to the new manifold. There will be mounting brackets. Remove the screws. These studs will need to be transferred over to the new manifold. Along with some hoses and wiring harness. And we'll need to remove the high pressure fuel rail from that old manifold. You can pry that free. Then we need to replace the seals and O-rings on the fuel injectors. This is important on these direct injected engines. Be sure to get new seals, new O-rings on the top of the fuel injector, and then also new seals on the bottom. Gonna apply some silicone lubricant to those O-rings so that they don't tear when you're reinstalling them. There you can see the new lower seal for the injector and the retaining clip. With all those seals changed, the injectors can be pushed back into the fuel rail and the electrical connectors reattached. Now that fuel rail can go on to the new manifold. Make sure everything's lined up properly and clipped into place. Can tighten those 2 Torx bolts. These are pretty low torque since they're going into plastic. Gonna reinstall that high pressure line onto the new manifold as well. Make sure those threads line up and then tighten that fuel fitting down. Now we can go ahead and change over the rest of the vacuum hoses, breather hoses, onto that new manifold. Maybe a good idea to take photos as you're taking this apart. You can use to be referenced as you're putting it back together on the new manifold. We're going to reinstall that hose mounting bracket. Again, you don't need to tighten these retaining screws very tight. A lot of them are going into plastic. Gonna put those mounting studs into the new manifold. And now, before reinstalling the new manifold, take a moment and clean some of the carbon buildup in those intake ports. These direct injected engines can get quite a bit of carbon buildup. Now we can carefully install the new manifold. Make sure that the fuel injectors are lining up in their ports. And we will reconnect the manifold runner sensor. And then we'll go ahead and tighten those manifold bolts down. It's best to do these by hand, just to not over tighten them into the aluminum cylinder head. Sometimes mechanics get a good feel for the electric ratchets, but if you haven't used them a whole lot, it's best to do that by hand. We'll reconnect the high pressure fuel sensor, as well as the camshaft position sensor and the vacuum hose. Now we need to reconnect the other end of the high pressure fuel line to the fuel pump. Now we can go ahead and get that throttle body back in. It's a little difficult to line that up because you're working upside down. But take your time. Get the bolts started one at a time. And then tighten those evenly back and forth. Reinstall that oil filter or a new oil filter. We can install the purge control valve and reconnect the throttle body connectors. The intake pressure sensor in the front of the manifold. We can bring that evap purge hose down and get that back into place. And then we'll also bring those coolant hoses back over and reconnect them as well. Use a pair of channel locks or hose clamp pliers to move those spring clamps back to their original position. We'll reinstall the coolant hose mounts. This keeps all those hoses in their correct place. And then also reinstall the wire bracket mounts. So our Torx screws as well. We'll reconnect the intake runner vacuum hose and that temperature sensor. Reinstall the breather hose. And at this point we need to get back under the vehicle, reinstall the air intake tube. With those Torx bolts for the brackets, and then tightening those hose clamps as well. Back underneath the vehicle, we'll reinstall that plastic under tray. Has 7 Torx screws. Okay, back up top, we'll reconnect the boost pressure sensor, which is in line in that air intake tube. And we can reinstall the air cleaner, breather hose, and the mass airflow sensor. We'll place that fuel supply hose back into its mounting points and reinstall the engine cover. We'll need to go ahead and refill the coolant since some was lost. And then also, after changing this manifold, we need to reset the adaptations for the engine computer. You'll start the engine, check the oil, and add any if necessary, and you're all done.